Kael Drayken awoke to the sound of silence, a silence so deep it pressed against his skull like a vice. He no longer heard the hum of the engines or the distant chatter of his crew. Instead, there was only the rhythmic thrum of something alien pulsing through his body. His first instinct was to breathe, but his lungs were unresponsive. Panic gripped him as his chest remained still, yet he was alive, or something close to it. His eyes darted around, struggling to adjust to the dim greenish glow suffusing the space around him. This wasn't the bridge of the solstice, the dreadnought he had commanded in his former life. This was something far darker. Kael tried to sit up, but his body refused to obey. His limbs were heavy, weighted with a strange gelatinous sensation. He finally realized why when he saw his arm, pale, mottled flesh marred with black, vine-like veins that pulsated beneath the surface. Where once his hand had been steady and strong, it was now a malformed claw, the fingers elongated and tipped with sharp, keratinous points. His mind screamed even as his voice could not. Something moved within him, something alive, probing, shifting through his neural pathways like a serpent winding through a hollowed log. It whispered to him, not with words but with compulsions, pushing him to rise, to submit. The memories came flooding back. The ambush at Outpost Theta, his fleet torn apart by grotesque ships that moved like living organisms. The Solstice had fought valiantly, delivering one punishing blow after another, until a massive tendril-like weapon punched through the hull, flooding the ship with spore-filled mist. His crew died screaming as their bodies convulsed, reshaped into something monstrous. And then, the darkness had claimed him. When Kael finally stood, it wasn't of his own volition. His legs moved awkwardly, as though learning to walk again. Around him were others, former crew members and soldiers, their bodies twisted into hideous forms, their eyes blank and lifeless. They stood in eerie unison, awaiting orders they no longer had the will to resist. The chamber he found himself in was not a ship in the traditional sense. Its walls pulsed like living tissue, veins of luminous green ichor pumping through organic conduits. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something metallic like rust and blood. He stumbled forward, his boots, what was left of them, squelching against the flesh-like floor. A massive bulkhead opened ahead, revealing the fleet he now commanded. Through a translucent viewport, he could see the Necrotic Fleet stretching across the void. Each ship was an abomination, a fusion of steel and sinew, their hulls bristling with biomechanical growths. Kael could feel them as if they were extensions of his own body, their presence echoing in the recesses of his mind. And then, the voice came. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense, but a tidal wave of intent, crashing over him, binding him in its grasp. The hive. It flooded his thoughts, drowning his protests beneath its overwhelming will. He was no longer Kael Drayken, commander of the Solstice. He was something far worse, the leader of the Necrotic Fleet, an unwilling puppet in the hands of something far greater than himself. But in the depths of the hive's control, Kael found a sliver of himself, something the infection hadn't fully consumed. As the fleet prepared to strike another human colony, he fought against the tide of commands, his mind clawing desperately for control. He knew that resistance was futile. The hive's will was absolute. Yet a small ember of defiance burned within him, refusing to be extinguished. The fleet began its descent on Colony Nexus 12, a thriving mining outpost on the edge of human space. Kael watched helplessly as the Necrotic Fleet tore through the colony's defenses, its grotesque vessels disgorging hordes of reanimated soldiers onto the surface. He could feel their triumph, their hunger, as though it were his own. He hated himself for it. In the chaos, a human signal cut through the noise in his mind, a faint, desperate distress call. For a moment, it was as though he could hear his own voice in their cries for help. A flicker of memory, the faces of his crew, his family, rose unbidden to his thoughts, breaking through the hive's grip. Kael focused on the signal, amplifying it within the hive's vast network. He wasn't sure why he did it. Perhaps it was a desperate attempt to hold on to the last shreds of his humanity. The hive noticed his defiance. It retaliated with searing pain, a surge of energy ripping through his neural pathways. His vision blurred, and his malformed body convulsed. But the pain only steeled his resolve. Somewhere in the distance, the distress signal persisted, a glimmer of hope in an abyss of despair. Kael Drayken piloted the captured necrotic cruiser through the desolate expanse of space, his mind a battlefield of conflicting impulses. The hive pushed against him constantly, a grinding pressure like teeth gnashing against the walls of his consciousness. But Kael's will, though battered, was holding. For now, the distress signal, faint but persistent, led him to the outskirts of human-controlled space. The outpost came into view, a derelict structure adrift against the void. Its once proud metal hull was corroded and scarred, evidence of battles fought and long since lost. Kael docked with the precision of a man who had performed the maneuver countless times, though his grotesque new limbs moved more stiffly than he remembered. The cruiser groaned as it latched onto the outpost, its organic components pulsating unnervingly against the station's metal airlock. As he stepped onto the outpost, Kael's boots echoed on the metallic floor, a sharp contrast to the wet squelch of the necrotic ship. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and decay, and the faint hum of failing systems reverberated through the corridors. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint, static-laden crackle of the signal he had followed. It came from deep within the station. Kael's mangled body moved awkwardly, but purposefully as he followed the signal. His mutated hand hovered over the sidearm clipped to his belt. A human weapon scavenged from the remains of his past life. Though the hive's influence was never fully absent, he had begun to learn its limits. The core embedded in his chest could control his body, but it couldn't predict his thoughts. That sliver of independence was his only weapon. He found the source of the signal in a control room near the station's center. The space was a mess of shattered consoles and strewn data drives, but a single monitor flickered weakly, displaying looping telemetry. As Kael approached, the signal resolved into a distorted voice, human, but faint and distorted. "This is Dr. Lyra Van. If you're hearing this, then it's already too late." Kael's hand hovered over the console, his malformed fingers hesitating before finally connecting with the controls. The screen brightened, revealing a grainy image of a woman. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken and shadowed, but there was defiance in her voice. "They call it the Devourer," she said. a living superorganism that operates across vast distances. It doesn't conquer, it consumes. The Necrotic Fleet is just the first stage. The core in your chest, it's a seed. Every colony it infects is fertilizer for its growth. Kael's breath caught, if he could still call it breathing. The hive within him seemed to recoil at the words, a subtle shift in the pressure that invaded his mind. He forced himself to watch as the woman on the screen continued. We encountered it decades ago on the far edge of the system. We thought we could contain it. We were wrong. It can't be destroyed, not in any way we understand. All we can do is resist, delay its advance. The message looped, her face freezing briefly before repeating. Kael's jaw clenched as he pieced together the truth. The hive was not the master of the Necrotic Fleet. It was merely an instrument, a tendril of something far greater. The Devourer was the true architect of this nightmare, a colossal entity lurking in the shadows of space, feeding on the despair and destruction left in its wake. As he processed the revelation, a sound echoed through the station. Footsteps, human, hurried. Kael spun, his clawed hand tightening around his sidearm. From the darkness emerged a small group of survivors, their faces gaunt but unmistakably alive. At the front of the group was a woman whose image Kael had just seen, Dr. Lyra Van. Her eyes widened at the sight of him, and her hand shot to the weapon at her side. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. "You're one of them." Kael raised his hands, or what was left of them, in a gesture of surrender. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice guttural and distorted. The words felt foreign in his throat, as though the hive resisted their formation. "I came because of your signal." Lyra studied him, her weapon still aimed at his malformed chest. The others behind her whispered anxiously, but she silenced them with a sharp wave. "The signal was automated," she said. "We never expected anyone to come, and certainly not one of you." "I'm not one of them," Kael insisted. "Not fully." He gestured toward the console. "I heard your message. I know about the Devourer." Lyra's expression shifted, suspicion giving way to a flicker of hope. She lowered her weapon slightly, though her stance remained guarded. "If you're telling the truth, then you're the first infected who's resisted the core's control." Kael nodded, though the motion was stiff and unnatural. "I don't have much time. The hive knows I'm here. It's only a matter of—" A sudden shudder ran through the station, and Kael's sentence was cut short. He didn't need to say the words. The hive had found him. Lyra's eyes widened. "They're coming," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She turned to her group. "Prepare the defenses, now!" Kael took a step toward her, his grotesque form looming over her slight frame. "If we want to survive this, you need to help me," he said. "We have to sever the hive's control. If I can break free, I can turn its strength against the Devourer." Lyra hesitated, the weight of her decision etched across her face. Then, with a curt nod, she said, "Follow me." Together, they ran deeper into the station, the echoes of the approaching Necrotic Fleet growing louder with every step. The battle for humanity's survival began not with the roar of cannons, but with a transmission, a fragile thread of trust stretched across the abyss. Kael Drayken stood in the dimly lit war room of the Unity Station, a massive orbital fortress that had once been the pride of humanity's defensive network. Now it was battered and scarred, its defenses barely holding against the relentless onslaught of the Necrotic Fleet. Kael's reflection in the polished surface of the tactical display was a nightmare of distorted flesh and alien intrusion. Blackened veins pulsed visibly beneath his skin, branching out from the necrotic core embedded in his chest. His left eye, now a pale glowing orb, saw the world differently, a constant overlay of the Hive's fragmented vision, showing ships, soldiers, and tactical movements as if they were extensions of his own body. Across from him, Admiral Tobias Kane studied the projection of the Necrotic Fleet, his scarred face hard as stone. Kane's distrust of Kael was palpable, but the grim reality of their situation had forced his hand. They couldn't afford to waste firepower on fighting each other when the greater threat loomed on the horizon. "The fleet is adapting," Kane said, his gravelly voice breaking the silence. "Every time we strike a formation, they counter with a precision that shouldn't be possible. It's as if they know our plans before we do." "They do," Kael replied. His voice was raspy, alien, each word a struggle against the Hive's relentless whispers. "The Hive sees everything through me. It's only a matter of time before they use me to compromise this station." Kane's hand twitched toward the sidearm holstered at his hip. "You're saying we should kill you?" "I'm saying you should trust me," Kael countered, his disfigured face twisting with frustration. "I've resisted this long. I can give you a chance to break the siege, but you have to let me lead." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. It was Lyra Van who broke it, stepping forward from the shadows where she had been poring over a collection of scavenged data cores. "Kael's right," she said. "The Hive uses him as a node to coordinate its forces. If he can disrupt that connection, even temporarily, it might give us an opening." "And if he can't?" Kane shot back. "What then? He's a walking bomb waiting to go off." Lyra glared at the Admiral, her tone sharp. "If you have a better idea, I'm all ears." Kane didn't reply, his jaw clenching as he turned his attention back to the tactical display. Kael could see the calculations running through the man's mind, the impossible odds and the dwindling options. Finally, Kane sighed and gave a grudging nod. "Fine, we'll try it your way. But if you show even a hint of turning on us..." "You'll kill me," Kael interrupted. "I know." Lyra moved to Kael's side, her gaze meeting his. "The Hive is going to fight back the moment you try to interfere. You'll need to tap into the necrotic core's full potential to have any chance of overriding their network." Kael's chest tightened. He knew what that meant, letting the core sink deeper into his mind, allowing its tendrils to weave into the very fabric of his thoughts. It was a dangerous gamble, one that could easily cost him the last remnants of his humanity. But the alternative was unthinkable. "I'll do it," he said. "Just tell me what I need to do." The Necrotic Fleet descended upon Unity Station like a swarm of locusts, blotting out the stars with their grotesque forms. Organic tendrils writhed along the hulls of their ships, their weapons pulsating with eerie greenish light. Unity's defensive cannons roared to life, firing a relentless barrage of plasma and railgun rounds into the void. Explosions lit up the darkness, but for every necrotic vessel destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. Kael stood at the heart of Unity's command center, his claws digging into the armrests of the neural interface chair. Lyra worked frantically at the console beside him, linking his necrotic core to the station's tactical systems. "You'll have access to the Hive's local network," she explained, "but if you go too deep—" "I know the risks," Kael said, cutting her off. "Just do it." The moment the connection was established, Kael's world exploded into chaos. The Hive's network flooded his mind, an overwhelming tide of alien thoughts and sensations. He could see through the eyes of every necrotic soldier, feel the pulsating hunger of their corrupted flesh. He clenched his teeth, focusing on his own thoughts, his own identity, as he searched for a way to disrupt the Hive's coordination. Outside, the battle raged on. Unity Station's defenses were failing, its shields flickering as necrotic boarding pods slammed into the hull. Kane's fleet fought valiantly, their ships weaving through the chaos to deliver precision strikes, but the odds were stacked against them. Kael found the nexus of the Hive's control, a pulsating node of alien energy buried deep within the fleet's network. It was a linchpin, a critical point where the Devourer's influence flowed into the Necrotic Fleet. He focused all his willpower on severing it, forcing the core within him to attack its own network. The Hive fought back with a vengeance. Pain racked Kael's body as the core lashed out, its tendrils tightening around his mind. He could feel himself slipping, his thoughts fracturing under the strain. Images of his former life flashed before him. His crew, his family, the solstice. He clung to those memories like a lifeline, using them to anchor himself against the Hive's assault. "Kael," Lyra's voice cut through the haze. "You're destabilizing the network. Keep going." Kael roared, a guttural sound that echoed through the command center. With one final surge of effort, he tore through the nexus, severing the Hive's connection to the local fleet. The necrotic ships faltered, their movements becoming erratic and disorganized. Unity's defenses capitalized on the opening, obliterating wave after wave of the now fractured fleet. But Kael didn't stop. He pushed deeper into the Hive's network, searching for any trace of the Devourer itself. What he found was worse than he had imagined. A vast, pulsating presence lurking in the void, its consciousness incomprehensible. It was watching him, waiting. The connection broke suddenly, and Kael slumped forward in the chair, his body trembling. Lyra caught him before he fell, her voice filled with urgency. "You did it. The fleet is breaking apart." Kael's glowing eye flickered as he looked up at her. "It's not over," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The Devourer knows we're coming." The station shuddered beneath them, and the lights flickered. The battle was won, but the war had only just begun. The silence in the aftermath of the battle was haunting. Unity Station drifted in a graveyard of wreckage, the remains of the Necrotic Fleet scattered like broken bones across the void. Fires burned in the husks of human ships, their flames guttering against the cold vacuum of space. Kael Drayken stood in the observation deck, staring out at the devastation with his lone, glowing eye. His body, now barely recognizable, trembled under the weight of his own existence. The core in his chest pulsed erratically, its once dominant tendrils weakened but far from dormant. Every beat was a reminder of the price he had paid to sever the hive's connection. His flesh hung loose and gray, his limbs more alien than human. He was a grotesque amalgamation of what he had been and what the hive had turned him into. Yet, for the first time since his transformation, he felt the faint stirrings of freedom. It was fleeting, fragile, but it was his. Behind him, Lyra Van entered the room. She moved with a limp, her body battered from the siege, but her determination was undiminished. In her hands, she held the device they had worked so hard to build, a weapon born of desperation and scavenged knowledge, one that could end the Devourer's hold over the remnants of the Necrotic Fleet. It was a crude and volatile creation, its core humming with unstable energy. "You're sure about this?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. Kael didn't turn to face her. He couldn't bear to see the pity in her eyes. "There's no other way," he said, his voice rough, like gravel grinding against metal. "The Devourer is still out there. It knows we've weakened its control, and it won't stop until it regains what it's lost." Lyra hesitated, her grip tightening on the weapon. "If you do this, you won't survive. The core will—" "I know," Kael interrupted, finally turning to her. His gaze locked on hers, the faint glimmer of his human eye meeting her steely resolve. "I lost my life the day the hive took me. This is all I have left to give." Lyra looked away, her expression torn. She had seen his strength, his defiance, and she had come to believe in him despite the monster he had become. But now she had to let him go. Kael reached out, his clawed hand trembling as it rested on her shoulder. "Promise me something," he said, his voice softer now. "When this is over, tell them what really happened. Tell them I fought for them." Lyra nodded, her throat too tight to respond. She handed him the weapon, its unstable energy vibrating faintly in his hands. It felt warm, almost alive, a paradoxical comfort against the cold emptiness that had consumed him. Kael's stolen necrotic cruiser shuddered as it accelerated toward the heart of the void. The weapon's energy output made the ship's systems flicker, the lights dimming in a rhythm that matched the pounding in his chest. He could feel the Devourer ahead, its presence a vast, incomprehensible weight pressing against his mind. It was waiting for him, a predator confident in its inevitability. As he approached the coordinates Lyra had calculated, the Devourer revealed itself. It wasn't a single entity, but an impossibly massive organism, its body an amalgamation of writhing flesh and pulsating bioluminescence. It dwarfed anything Kael had ever seen, its sheer scale defying logic. Tendrils the size of cities stretched out into the void, connecting it to the remnants of the Necrotic Fleet. The hive's voice returned, a cacophony of demands and accusations. "You are nothing, a tool, an aberration." The core in Kael's chest responded, its tendrils surging with renewed vigor, trying to reclaim him. Kael gritted his teeth, his claws digging into the weapon. "Not anymore," he growled. He activated the weapon's charge, its energy spike sending tremors through the ship. The Devourer reacted immediately, its tendrils lashing out to intercept him. The The cruiser buckled under the impact, alarms blaring as systems failed one by one. Kael forced the ship forward, piloting through sheer willpower as the hive screamed in his mind. He reached the heart of the Devourer, a massive, pulsating core of flesh and light. It was both beautiful and horrifying, a paradox of life and death. Kael set the weapon's timer, his mutated fingers trembling as he locked it into place. The hive's voice turned desperate. "You cannot destroy me. You are part of me." Kael laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and raw. "You took everything from me," he said, his voice rising with defiance. "Now, I'll take everything from you." As the timer ticked down, Kael sat in the pilot's chair, his body trembling with exhaustion. He closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment of peace. Images of his crew, his family, and the life he had lost flickered through his mind. He held on to them, letting them anchor him as the ship's systems failed around him. The weapon detonated. The explosion was a blinding surge of light and energy, a force so immense it rippled across the void. The Devourer's core disintegrated, its tendrils severed, its hive mind collapsing into silence. The Necrotic Fleet, now rudderless, imploded in a chain reaction of destruction. The void was left eerily quiet, the only remnants of the battle drifting as dust and ash. Lyra watched from Unity Station, her face pale as the monitors went dark. The silence in the command center was deafening, every survivor holding their breath as the debris field expanded across the stars. Kael's ship was gone. No signal, no trace. Only the faint echo of his final act lingered in the void. Tears burned in Lyra's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she stood tall, her voice steady as she turned to the surviving crew. "He gave us a chance," she said. "Now it's up to us to rebuild." The station's comms crackled to life, a faint signal from a nearby colony. Survivors. Humanity was battered, broken but still alive. As Lyra stared out at the debris field, she whispered to herself, "You fought for us, Kael. I'll make sure they remember." Far beyond the stars, in the vast, unknowable void, the Devourer's remnants floated in silence. But the faintest pulse of light flickered in the darkness, a reminder that while one battle had been won, the void was never truly empty.